On a recent Sunday morning, a handful of men prepared two divers for a dark descent to the bottom of the St. Johns River.
How's it feeling, Steve?
26 feet below the surface lie the remains of a once majestic steamship, the Mapleleaf. But these men are not searching for gold or silver. They seek treasure of a different kind. Tonight, Cover Stories focuses on one of the most important shipwreck sites in America. Join us for the Mapleleaf, time capsule of the Civil War. In the early morning hours of April 1st, 1864, a Civil War transport, the Mapleleaf, was quietly steaming north on Florida's St. Johns River, headed for the Union base at Jacksonville. All but 4 of the 66 passengers on board were sleeping as the pilot steered the ship around the bend at Mandarin Point. The time was 4 a.m. The ill-fated steamship had hit a Confederate mine. 4 crewmen asleep in the forward part of the ship were killed by the blast. The remaining passengers scrambled to the lifeboats and escaped to safety. The crippled steamship sank into the muddy bottom of the St. Johns River. The Mapleleaf would never sail again. Nearly a century after the sinking of the Mapleleaf, Dr. Keith Holland, a Jacksonville dentist, was searching for a way to combine his love for scuba diving with his interest in local history. Dr. Holland had grown up on the shores of the St. Johns River. He remembered seeing old dog pilings after they were taken from the river. The tops of the pilings looked old and rotten, while the portion of wood that had been buried in the mud looked brand new. It followed that any ship or cargo buried in that same mud would be preserved in the same way. All he needed was a shipwreck in the St. Johns River. Dr. Holland's research eventually led to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. There, he discovered that the Mapleleaf had been sunk with as much as 400 tons of cargo. If the mud had done its job, he had discovered a site unprecedented in Civil War archaeology.
In the very beginning, recognizing what was here and believing in it and understanding and knowing its full potential, but yet being in the midst of total, absolute skepticism. I mean, even my friends did not believe that it would be there. And after all, it was kind of hard to believe. I mean, why would it have remained for so long underwater and be so well preserved? And not only that, if it were that important, why hadn't somebody found it?
But just where was the Mapleleaf, and what kind of ship was it? The Mapleleaf was built in 1851 in Kingston, Ontario, during the golden era of steamship travel. Christened after Canada's most revered symbol, the Mapleleaf sailed the Great Lakes for more than a decade, enjoying a reputation as one of the most elegant steamships of the day.
It was a wooden, side-wheeled steamship, about 181 feet long, and it had 3 decks. And the saloon deck, which is where the passengers were, contained 44 cabins, which in those days it was considered to be a luxury ship. It was designed to carry not only passengers but freight, and it operated principally on Lake Ontario between New York State and Canada. The shipping business dried up on the lakes during the war. And on the east coast of the United States, there was a tremendous demand for steamers for the U.S. Army. And so the owners of the Mapleleaf sold it to a firm of Boston ship owners, who then chartered it to the Army in September 1862.
The Mapleleaf first entered the St. Johns River as a flagship for the Union invasion of Jacksonville in 1864. Union garrisons were set up in Jacksonville, protected by the firepower of the Federal warships. Outgunned on the river, the Confederate Army introduced a new weapon, the submarine torpedo.
The mines were a small barrel or a keg, about maybe the size of a beer keg, and had flotation devices on each end of it. It was filled with 70 pounds of gunpowder with a percussion cap. and it was tied to the bottom, moored to the bottom of the river so that it was about 3 feet below the surface. So it was invisible to the ships passing, and Mapleleaf struck one mine and sank almost immediately. Mines had been used elsewhere in the Mississippi River and also in Charleston, but this is the first occasion of a ship being struck by a mine in Florida.
The Union defeat at the Battle of Olustee signaled the last days for the steamship Mapleleaf.
After the Battle of Olustee, in which the Union Army took a considerable beating, the Union Army forces had to reinforce Jacksonville immediately, so they transported troops from everywhere on an emergency basis, and they did not have time to pack their baggage. And so ships were sent back to their bases to get their baggage later. And the Mapleleaf was returning to Jacksonville, carrying the baggage of 3 Union regiments when it landed at the Jacksonville dock.
Before her cargo could be unloaded, the Mapleleaf was sent to Palatka to deliver troops. She would never return. In 1984, Dr. Keith Holland was sure he had located the wreck of the Mapleleaf, but he needed proof, and he needed help.
I found the site first in the library. We then went through 3 years of research, then located it, physically realized it was beyond our reach. It was buried under so much mud. Slowly, I started building this volunteer army that came together.
Dr. Holland and the volunteers formed St. John's Archaeological Expeditions Incorporated, known for short as SAGI. The organization consists neither of trained archaeologists or professional treasure divers. Instead, SAGI is a group of professionals and businessmen with a common love for scuba diving and history. After securing the rights to excavate the wreck from national and state authorities, the team got to work.
We had all the permits that were required to actually dredge mud that we needed to do to be able to penetrate inside the vessel. So on July the 4th of 1988, I made the actual first penetration inside of the aft cargo hull. The first item I found probably shook us a little bit. It was what we thought at the time a plastic ruler. About 18 inches long. It felt like one of the modern day flexible plastic rulers, and when we got the item to the surface, we discovered it was black vulcanized hard rubber, and imprinted on it was U.S. Navy patented 1851. It was a hard rubber, vulcanized hard rubber navigational straight edge. So I think for me that was probably the most exciting point when we actually penetrated into the vessel and had positive proof at that time that we had a Civil War vessel.
The reason the preservation quality is so excellent here in the St. Johns River is because the mud excludes all oxygen. And in order for things to rot or decompose or deteriorate, you must have oxygen, whether it's in air or underwater. And being that the mud has no oxygen in it, those things just don't decompose. Things as delicate as paper don't decompose.
Working from a platform, the team has labeled the Mud Puppy. Divers on the expedition face a number of dangers and difficulties, including working in zero visibility.
When you go in the water after about 5 feet, you lose all visibility. So you're virtually black water diving. Think of your mind as a database, and as soon as you reach the point where you can't see anymore, your mind's just searching its files, and as soon as, say, you touch deck, being a light flashes and you have a mental picture of what you're on, and as you feel and grope in the mud, or when you're trying to work to accomplish a task, you constantly have a mental picture.
It's real hard to keep your orientation down there when you're trying to move from one part of the wreck to the other, and there's not a lot of landmarks down there that the divers can associate with. We have a center baseline from the bow of the ship to the stern of the ship that they can use, and it's marked off in 10-foot increments. And so as long as they're in that center area traveling north or south along the baseline, they're fine. But once they have to move off that baseline to one side or the other of the ship, they start losing that relationship to where they are down there. There is a lot of disarticulated timbers and iron pipes sticking up. The diver has to be very aware of where his hose is, that it's not getting caught up between the pipes and that type of thing. So that's why all of our divers wear bailout bottles, which is a secondary emergency air supply on their backs that'll give the diver about 20 minutes of underwater time, which would give them plenty of time to get back to the exit hole and get back to the surface.
Before any dive, team members huddle to review the plan of attack. Today, diver Steve Michaels and Bobby Lunsford are briefed about where to search for the engine of the old steamship. Miami-based steam engine specialist Finley Matheson has been brought in to help the team with the search.
Well, it's like diving in a big cup of black coffee. Can't see a thing. When you get to the bottom, you work your hand into some delightfully feeling ooze, and as long as there are not too many barnacles on the steel, you can get a good feeling of what's down there. We felt our way along the starboard boiler, along the face of it, and that was quite interesting. There's some parts protruding from the boiler that could be brought up and preserved. And then we tried to find the engine, which we couldn't, but we found the walking beam and the crank rod, and then traced our way back until we got caught up in the debris. And they're going to go down and try and clear that this morning.
The mud on the river bottom, up to 5 feet thick in some places, is both an asset and a liability for the recovery team. By preserving the artifacts, it gives their work value, but dredging the mud is a costly, time-consuming job. Once the mud is removed, however, the Mapleleaf begins to reveal some of her secrets about life during the Civil War.
One of the things that makes it important is not that it was a vessel carrying stacks of arms or ammunition or bayonets or cannons and carriages, because we have a tremendous amount of that material that survives from the Civil War period today. The thing that makes it important are that on that wreck, the small tokens of people's daily lives, like toothbrushes and pencils and objects, gaming pieces that they may have carved and made themselves, survive, and give us a lot of insight into the personal aspects of the American Civil War that for all practical purposes would otherwise have been lost.
What we have here are checkers that one of the soldiers had actually made out of clay so they could play checkers in their spare time. They had to improvise because there were not a lot of things that they could buy during these periods of time when they were out in the field. Another pastime that the men had was carving. They all enjoyed doing a lot of carving. They had much time to sit around. This one little piece here is a small wooden Bible that has the cross engraved in the front of it. Most people think that the soldiers spent a tremendous amount of time in actual fighting, but in truth, they had very little fighting time. One thing that they could use to mark their time was this short timer's clock, which the soldier actually whittled out of little pieces and interlocked the pieces to count down the days he had left to fight. Even in the smallest of items, we could find the intricate carvings that the soldiers did. Possibly this one was to remind them of a loved one left back home.
There's sort of an eerie feeling when you go inside here and you open a desk up and there's a pocket watch in there or a locket or some personal memento of a soldier that he certainly would much rather have taken back with him and taken home than have left here in a remote Florida city.
The expedition has recovered hundreds of pounds of Civil War artifacts from the wreck of the Mapleleaf. Yet this is less than 1% of the cargo that remains buried inside the ship.
All of these things, and I think it's appropriate to mention, don't belong to us. They belong to the public, and we just have the advantage and the ability to enjoy being involved in an underwater archaeology recovery site.
As far as Civil War archaeology goes, this is pretty much the place for artifacts. I mean, there's a greater concentration of Civil War artifacts here than any other spot in the country. So to be able to be here, it's actually history in the making itself as they recover, you know, these artifacts, as they document the site itself, as they discover more about the wreck. It's just fascinating for me.
The Mapleleaf expedition is funded with public money through a special grant from the state of Florida. Team members have taken a special interest in using their limited funds wisely.
What we've done that's unique and somewhat unusual is that we recover. We stop recovering when we think we are going to reach a financial burden on conserving those things. We conserve them. We then get our reports together and we put those things on display, and we do not go back and recover more things until we've done that. So we do what we call a full cycle site work, and when that's finished, in the event that something happens to us and we lose funding and we have to go away, the public has ended up with something, instead of everything moved from the river to a warehouse where now it is rotting because it's exposed to air.
For the expedition, recovering the artifacts is only one part of the job at hand. Once an object has been brought to the surface, steps are taken to preserve that artifact for future generations. At the Mapleleaf Conservatory, artifacts are first treated to prevent further decomposition. Then they are sketched, photographed, and stored for further use and study.
One of the more interesting items that was brought up this summer was a vulcanized rubber rain hat that the soldiers would have carried with them, probably out in the field. Although a lot of these items that we're finding were known to exist during the Civil War, very few of them have actually survived.
You know, and somebody told me one time, they ask you what's the neatest thing that you've recovered, and you tell them seashells. You know, it should be guns or mortars or gold or something of that nature. We've actually read from one of the chaplain of the 112th's diary of how they used to get up every morning and go out to Folly Island Beach and collect seashells. And in fact, almost every 3 boxes that we find, there are shells in there, collections of shells. These people didn't have an opportunity. They weren't asked to pack everything that you'd like to preserve for 120 years. It just happened. So where else in the world can you enter a time capsule like this that has such great preservation unless it were a tomb, intentionally buried?
The significance of the wreck of the Mapleleaf has taken on national proportions. America's chief historian, Edwin Barr, stated, "The wreck of the Mapleleaf is the most important repository of Civil War artifacts ever found and probably will remain so."
In our country, there are only 3 national landmark shipwreck sites, and that's the Monitor, the Utah, and the Arizona. Those 2 are, of course, Pearl Harbor ships. That's it. The Mapleleaf will probably be nominated as a national landmark in February of next year. So it certainly is a unique ship, and if our country nominates it as a landmark, that'll speak for itself.
In a statement sent to Cover Stories, Congresswoman Tilly Fowler pledged her support for the Mapleleaf Project and stated that she is asking some of her Florida colleagues to support the nomination for landmark status.
I think what's important to understand about what's going on here is that this is not a salvage operation. These artifacts are not going to go on the market or anything. This is an archaeological dig. Some people have volunteered their time hoping to maybe actually get an artifact, that kind of thing, and that's not the kind of idea we're out here for, and I think it's important for people to understand that.
The Mapleleaf expedition members and more than 140 volunteers continue to discover more about the Mapleleaf and what it can teach us about the Civil War.
We have studied and studied and studied the military aspect, the strategic aspect, the machinery that we created, the Monitor, the new advances in warfare. What we do not have, and that we are sadly lacking, is an opportunity to study the people who fueled that machine and what they did in this terrible time of their lives, how they traveled, what games they played, what things they did for recreation, what material they picked up along the way and confiscated as they traveled 3 years through this terrible time.
There's nothing in comparison going on in the United States in the way of archaeology and social history. This ship, the hold of this ship is full of personal belongings of the soldiers, including civilian artifacts which they've picked up along their campaigns. And most of this material is in marvelously preserved condition. And it's totally genuine. And every artifact that's brought up from there is authentic. And this will form the basis of a museum display, part of which is already at the Museum of Science and History in Jacksonville. And as additional items are brought up, this historic museum display will be expanded. And it's our opinion that this will become a nationally recognized archaeological project in the near future. We certainly hope so.
To me, in a sense, we have something that's a lot more valuable than silver and gold. We've got something that'll tell us about our heritage, and what they really need to understand is that this wreck impacts all of us. This is all of our citizens of this United States, not only Florida. It's their heritage and learning how their forefathers coped and how they forged a country to make it what it is today.